Today for the audit workshop, and we're going to turn this over to the gentleman from James Moore's, and that would be Zach Calfor, Wayne Drett, and Ben Clark. So feel free to start, sir. Thank you for being here. Yeah, let's hold on just a second. Let's see if we can get it loaded up.
Turn that on.
I'm assuming we're still trying, right?
All right, test. There we go.
Yes. Yes.
All right, so do you want to give it a couple seconds and see?
Yes, he had the.
He's working. Okay, yeah, he's working on it. So let's give it just a couple more minutes, let him see
Okay.
if we can get this loaded up. I wasn't aware there was a problem, otherwise I'd have given it another couple minutes. Sorry about that. Hey, I can't do no wrong. I'm on my way out.
Yeah, okay. Let's see how that works out. Kind of cool stuff.
Well, I'm not.
Why am I talking about that?
Oh, okay.
There's something out there.
I guess I should say it.
Jane Moody. Is that who you're thinking? Jane Moody. Yeah.
Oh, moving it over.
I think there it is. There it is.
I do not have control yet. Yeah, look.
Do you want to follow along this? Yes. It's the same thing that's up there. But
All right. Here we are. All right, we've got Vanna in position, I think. All right, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Zach Shalafor, partner, James Moore and Company. We are here to review the results of the annual financial statement audit for the September 30th, 2020 fiscal year. First and foremost, we'd like to thank you all again for the opportunity to work with the City of Lynn Haven. This is now our second audit that we've done working with you all, despite it only being about 12 months since we were first brought on to work with the city. This audit, of course, kind of more timely than last year. We were here last June discussing the 2019 audit. So more timely, and a big thank you as well to staff, Kiki and the finance team for all of their hard work working through this audit, continued just challenging times to work through everything in the COVID-19 environment, figuring out logistics to keep everyone as safe as possible. So a big thank you to that team, for the finance department for all of their help through this audit. So first, before we get into the numbers, we're going to go ahead and review the results of the audit. We do issue 5 audit reports in this document. These are management's financial statements with 5 reports that represent the results of the audit that we performed. The first report that we issue is the audit report on the financial statements. That's at the very front of the document. And we did issue an unmodified opinion here that the financial statements are fairly presented in all material respects. This is the report that you would see in any audit environment for a government, privately held company, public company. This is the best opinion that we can issue that says that the numbers reported in these financial statements are accurate and can be relied upon. The second report that we issue is a single audit report. This year, the city did spend more than $750,000 of both federal and state grant awards. When you go over those thresholds, we're then required to go in and perform effectively a mini compliance audit over your major grant programs. The largest program, of course, was the continued FEMA expenditures. Those all basically meet the scope for this testing based on when they are obligated. So some of those expenditures occurred in fiscal year 2020, some as well were from 2019, but required that added level of scrutiny in this audit based on the timing of when FEMA approves those expenditures. We also looked at 3 state grant programs, and in this report, we issued an unmodified opinion on all of those grant programs that those grant expenditures were in material compliance with the terms of those grant agreements and that the internal controls at the city to help ensure compliance were followed related to those grant expenditures. The third report that we issue is on internal control and compliance. This is required by governmental accounting standards, and what this is in a financial audit, there is no opinion expressed on the functioning of the internal controls of the city, but in looking at your financial reporting and financial statements, we do have to consider certain areas of the city's internal controls as it relates to the objective of accurate financial reporting. In this report, we did have 2 comments that we classified as material weaknesses. Both of these comments were repeat comments from the prior year, but it was really no surprise that we had those just based on the timing of when some personnel transitions took place during fiscal year 2020. Again, we just started working with you all about a year ago when you were about halfway through fiscal year 2020. So much of that was already water under the bridge before some of those corrective actions were taken related to the prior year audit. The 2 comments related to, first, just the timeliness of bank reconciliations. And again, largely it was in the first half of fiscal year 2020. Many of the bank reconciliations were just not done timely. They had to be caught up later on during the year. Per discussions with staff, bank reconciliations are currently up to speed from what we've been told. And of course, we'll look to really audit that and verify that report back in the fiscal year 2021 audit. And then the second comment that we had relates to audit adjustments for purposes of preparing the financial statements. And the theory here is that the numbers as they come out of your accounting system should effectively mirror and be all set to go for these final financial statement documents. If we do have significant adjustments to any of those numbers, we're required to report that to you, but ultimately it's really just a financial reporting area where there are many adjustments that we had related to all of the FEMA activity, getting your reimbursements and receivables in the proper fiscal year, same thing even on the payable side, just due to the magnitude of all of the activity related to the hurricane recovery. So this was one where it was really just, there are so many complex areas we are required to report that. But really there's not a whole lot of concern beyond that. And there were no operational issues or anything like that. It's purely getting things in the right bucket, the right classification for purposes of preparing this document. And then the fourth report that we issue is a separate management letter required by the Florida Auditor General. We look at a series of areas here. One relates to financial condition, if there were any certain metrics met with regard to financial condition, really on the negative sense, such as what's called the deteriorating financial condition, we would have to report those here. No such issues there, even with the impact of the hurricane, the hurricane bonds and so forth. The city still did rate as what's called inconclusive. The vast majority of cities do rate that way. So that was good to see that even with that impact, you weren't into that what's called unfavorable category. The other area in this report that we have to look at is a follow-up on any prior year comments. So I do want to highlight, while we had 2 comments this year that were repeated from the prior year, we pretty much could have told you 9 months ago, and maybe have then, that the expectation was those would be repeated based on kind of what we already knew about fiscal year 2020. But the other 6 comments from the prior year were resolved. So that's a pretty good kind of conversion rate in terms of remediating those, the absolute first go-round. And then the other part of that, too, is there were no new comments. So that's always good to see. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Audit comments are not designed to be just a slap on the wrist, a penalty. We're really here to help you all be better, help identify ways to improve controls, improve operations, and so forth. So they're not a bad thing, but it's certainly a good thing to say, hey, there were no new comments or anything like that, to say that something that was working well no longer was working well, or something to that effect. And then the 5th report that we issue is we do have to look at the city's compliance with state statutes over investments and investment policy. And we did note the city to be in compliance with those statutes in this report. And then lastly, at the very back of the audit document, there is a short response as required by federal standards from management addressing the status of those 2 findings. And again, it does reflect the fact that bank reconciliations are currently up to speed based on those discussions with staff. So we've hit kind of the overall results of the audit qualitatively. To look a little bit at the numbers now, the rest of the way, we're going to start with the general fund. So the general fund balance, this is really your reserves, your assets minus liabilities. You can see, looking at these numbers in total, your total general fund balance increased almost $5 million from the prior year. This increase is almost entirely attributable to the city did draw down on an economic disaster loan for $5 million this year. The way governmental accounting works, it's largely cash basis. So that $5 million, while at this point it's still, as of year end it was still owed, that shows up as an inflow or kind of a revenue to the general fund. So that increases the fund balance that we have there. To walk through those different buckets, basically at the top is money that you cannot spend or can only spend on certain things. At the bottom is the kind of no strings attached reserves. So the large number there, that restricted fund balance of about $3 million, that largely relates to your impact fee funds and infrastructure surtax dollars, where there's legal rules set by state statute over how those dollars can be spent. So those get pulled out of that total fund balance as restricted. There were no monies that met the committed definition, which would kind of be like restricted, but something done by ordinance or resolution of this body. And then the assigned bucket of $2.4 million, that's basically to say that that money has been earmarked. So that $2.4 million represented the cash carry forward in the fiscal year 2021 budget, to say that you all had appropriated $2.4 million worth of reserves to be potentially spent in the current fiscal year. And then the unassigned, that's just the residual once we back out all of those items that meet a different criteria. So on the next slide, what we've got to kind of put it into perspective is we look at your assigned plus your unassigned fund balance in total, because again, even though the assigned has been earmarked, you can change your mind over how those dollars will be spent. You have that full discretion. So we look at those 2 buckets of reserves relative to what was spent in the general fund, about $18.5 million in the 2020 fiscal year. Looking at that as a percentage or number of months in reserves, you're at about 73%, about 8.5 months in reserves. And we'd normally like to just say, how are you when we can look at the general fund kind of in a vacuum, where here we'll get to, we really have to look at it, the bigger picture, is that's a pretty healthy level. The GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, does recommend a minimum of 2 months, or really 3 months, they say, for a coastal community, which would be 25%. So in a vacuum, the general fund looks very healthy, and that does have you in a good position as you go forward and see how the disaster recovery fund ultimately shakes out over time. But as you look at that $13.5 million, one reminder as well is that includes that $5 million loan, which hopefully will be forgiven, but there's no guarantee on that. So if that loan does become due and payable, that's almost like taking $5 million right off the top of those reserves, depending how that shakes out. So that's the general fund. The disaster recovery fund is reported in a separate column in the financial statements. We've got a look at the 2-year history. Of course, now we've had 2 years of activity on this new fund, and we can see there was a total fund balance of about $24 million as of September 30th, 2020. To kind of put that into perspective, with the bonds that were issued for about $32 million, if hypothetically everything with regard to the disaster recovery had been closed out, was done, and this was the absolute final number with nothing left to be done, you'd be about $8 million short of that debt amount, because this balance here basically represents the ongoing activity plus those debt proceeds when that cash came in when those bonds were issued. So in theory, if you were to have to close this out, everything was done as of last September 30th, it would require about an $8 million transfer from the general fund to close it out. So again, the hope is that this fund balance in future years, reimbursements exceed the ongoing expenditures, and that gap's narrowed in terms of what that general fund subsidy or contribution will look like at the end. Hopefully it works out to be zero. But that is just kind of one very significant contingency in terms of going forward, what will everything look like? Because when it comes to FEMA, I mean, until the check comes in the door and is cashed, I would say there's no guarantees with regard to FEMA as far as how much money will come back in the form of reimbursement and when. I don't know if Vicki or Kiki would disagree with me on that, but I'm sure they'd say the exact same thing based on, there's lots of hours involved I've learned from finance folks and managers that, in other communities that we've worked with that have, between Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Matthew, Irma, many cases here, and it's a painful process to work. Every dollar of reimbursement received is well earned, based on the staff time that it does require. But again, that kind of paints the picture of where we're at now. It's still going to be a moving target, but that's kind of what we'll monitor in coming years to say, well, where are you at versus what's the balance outstanding on those bonds? Real quickly, to look at the other governmental funds that the city has. First is the CRA. You have about $450,000 of fund balance in the CRA fund. This is, of course, restricted for continued reinvestment in the CRA. One highlight related to the CRA this year is there was a change in state statute almost 2 years ago now that required all CRAs with over $100,000 of revenues or expenditures to have a separate audit issued. So there is a separate document that we've worked with staff to issue that's about 25 pages long. That's a snapshot look at just the CRA financial statements. It does include the same reports that we discussed related to the city audit, except for there is no single audit on the grants related to the CRA. It's just the other 4 reports. We did issue clean opinions there, and we also had to issue an opinion on the CRA's compliance with state statutes related to the use of CRA funds. And we did note that those expenditures were in compliance with those state statutes. And just kind of one note is, while this is a new document, the CRA has always been audited, last year when we did your audit and from looking at some of the audits before, as what's called a major fund in your financial statements. And that effectively means that it's always gotten the same level of attention that it got this year. It's really the only change is the separate document was required based on the change in state statutes. As far as a few other funds, both kind of dwindling down, there is the debt service fund that had about a $15,000 fund balance as of the end of the current fiscal year. And then the disaster relief fund, that separate entity, of course, is wound down subsequent to year end. It had about a $3,500 fund balance as of September 30th. So all the numbers we've talked about so far, those represent your governmental funds. And the way governmental accounting works is there's your fund financial statements, which really mirror the way that you budget, the way that you operate. It's largely cash basis. And then there's financial statements presented and reconciled to for what's called your governmental activities. And this basically takes your general fund, disaster recovery fund, and it adds all of the long-term items like your capital assets. When you go pave a road, you record an asset for that road, even though you can't go and sell that. So normally we don't spend a lot of time on these statements just because they're not really relevant to operations. You don't use them to budget or anything like that. They're really just required for reporting purposes. But what we wanted to look at here, again, because you've got your general fund and your disaster recovery fund that are so interrelated, but they're presented separately. So based on just the timing of when dollars might move to subsidize the disaster recovery fund, it's really important to kind of see the whole picture and say, what direction are we moving when we look at those collectively? So on this slide, really the area that we look at is the unrestricted net position. Again, that's kind of to say, what's your residual reserve on these statements where once you've taken everything else out. So the big piece here is looking at 18 to 19. You can see that unrestricted number went down about $6.5 million, again, largely due to the impacts of the hurricane. So no surprise there whatsoever. But kind of the way I look at it is that gave us a new starting point to say, okay, we're at a negative $4 million in that unrestricted. And now let's kind of monitor and measure progress going forward with the hopes that that number will work back to zero and then move back into the positive. So that has moved about $2.3 million in a favorable direction this year. So it's not the end-all be-all, but it is good to see as kind of one quick high-level look to say, okay, do we see anything that says things are not moving in the right direction? This absolutely is a positive trend that hopefully will continue in the years to come. To look at your business type funds, we're going to look at kind of the same measurement, again, the unrestricted net position. So this is looking at really the assets minus liabilities in your business type funds like water and sewer. Once you back out anything related to your capital assets and your long-term debt and any cash or otherwise that's restricted to be used for specific purposes. So again, what we're going to look at here really is the trend to say, okay, year over year, what direction are those moving? So we've got two funds with a small decrease, two with a small increase, and ultimately, about what we expected, just because there's that continued rebuild of those systems. Some expenses were a little bit higher as additional repair work to really get those systems up and running. Revenues still kind of in a recovery mode as well. So what we kind of see here is nothing in terms of there's not an increase in a couple funds, but not a major decrease or anything that's really a red flag type of thing. Just one area that we're going to really monitor the next few years and say, okay, we will want to hopefully start seeing some movement in the positive direction once things really settle down in terms of both the revenue side and the expenditure side, and everything's kind of operating, absolutely 100% back to normal like the pre-hurricane days. With the thought that once that stability is there, we can say, okay, if there were a decrease, then it becomes a question of, well, are the rates in place still appropriate or otherwise? So it's too early to kind of really tell where those are at. But again, no major red flags. It's not like those were huge, significant decreases that were any major cause for concern. And then lastly, what I'd like to hit on is the pension funds. This is one where for many cities, it's a very significant financial reporting item because for about 6 years now, governments have been required to report the unfunded pension liabilities on your financial statements. For many cities that we work with, the size of Lynn Haven, there's probably, say, a net unfunded pension liability, oftentimes of $15, $20, $25 million. And so that shows up as a very large liability to those cities. Although your pension plans are in a very positive position, as you can see on this slide, you've got one plan, your police plan, that's actually a little bit, it has a net pension asset based on those assets exceeding the actuarial liability of those future pension benefits. And then your general employees and fire plans are both very small numbers. In the aggregate, you're about a $1.4 million net liability, which again, many cities your size would love to have that number be that small. All of those plans, basically at least 90% funded. General here is 89.85%, but we'll say that's about 90%. Fire at 95% and police at 112% funded. All very positive areas. And again, while we do show those liabilities on the financial statements, the real key here to the plans is that you have an actuary every year, or the pension boards have an actuary come in, look at that liability, look at the assumptions, make sure they're reasonable, and then the city has a required contribution to those plans based on those valuations. Those contributions have been made, that's what we look at, and that's really the key to the long-term health of those plans. These numbers just really help bring additional transparency to the city's financial statements based on the health of those plans at the financial statement date. The only observation that we do have here is we highlighted the discount rates used by each of those plans. Our general employees plan is at 7.5%, police and fire at 7.25%, and it's an absolute moving target. It's a long-term assumption where the actuaries and the plan's investment advisors say, okay, what interest rate on the pension investments will be earned over the 30, 40 year life and just indefinite kind of future of those plans. So we're not investment advisors. We have no basis to say what number is right or not right here, but from just kind of what we see in the industry is we've seen a handful of plans trying to get probably to a target of 7%. It's kind of become the industry norm. Some are even below that. The Florida retirement system in their most recent valuation used a 6.8% discount rate. So those would have a small impact. The unfunded liability maybe would go up a couple $1 million. The funded percentages maybe down a few percent if those rates came down a bit. But again, they're not excessively high or anything like that. It's just kind of as we look at it, the one thing that based on what we've seen, maybe, hopefully the pension boards will be looking at those in the future to really say, are they comfortable with those rates or should they potentially come down a little bit? But overall, again, contributions are being made as required, and just the overall position of those plans, again, is one that probably 90% of cities at least that have their own pension plans like Lynn Haven would probably be more than glad to trade positions with where you all are at with regard to those pension plans. So with that covers all of my comments. I'd be more than glad to answer any questions, and I thank you all again for the chance to be here with you this afternoon.
So Zach, thank you very much for giving that presentation and for meeting with me earlier and going through this personally with me. My main takeaway that I want to make sure that I foot stomp, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that there were no new comments. There were out of the 8 comments from the prior audit, the city has resolved 6 of those 8 comments.
That's correct.
So we're on the uphill swing of fixing things, from what I see. So thank you for that. Does the commission got any questions?
I had one. I just wanted to finish up because we were talking about it before we started. Are we still using Jay Moody as our financial consultant, or did we use him in 220? I know we had him here in 219 after the hurricane.
219, and we had him a little bit in 220.
220?
I think just a little bit.
At the beginning of the year. Okay, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem, yeah, I would just like to echo your sentiments as well. I'm very pleased with the city, the work that the city staff has done. We're being very conscious. I know it doesn't seem like it sometimes with cities or with politicians and everything else, but we're trying to be very conscious of our processes here, of our transparency here, and making sure that we're doing the best for our citizens. And I feel like this reflects the hard work that we have put in, all of us as a city and citizens as well during the rebuild, these hard times. So again, I'm just thankful to the city staff and to Vicki and Shannon and Kiki. They've done a great job, and that's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to go ahead and echo off what everybody just said, and that stuck out with me when we met personally earlier. That there was 8 things, and 6 of them, had been taken care of, but the 2 that weren't. When we spoke, you said it's very evident that they are being taken care of now, but at the time they think, you said that they were still. They still had not been taken care of, but the reconciliation of the statements is happening now. So I too said directly that our systems are in place, and thank our city manager and for the way that she realigned the finance department so we can take care of this. And it's kind of an open book kind of thing, and it hopefully made your job easier in the year that you've been here. I know when you take over from another company, sometimes there's little roadblocks and stuff, but I think it was well received when I read everything today, and I'm very, very thankful that we have the transparency that we have. So, thank you.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes, so I'm going to open the floor to, did the public have any questions for the auditors at this time? Hearing and seeing none, I think we are done unless there's anybody else wants to say anything. All right, thank you very much for coming, and commission meeting is in about 25 minutes.
Thank you.
What? Your nickname? Who nicknamed